This is the beginning of the construction stage for the C57D Star Cruiser from the Forbidden Planet classic sci-fi movie. Now what I've decided to do is start with the interior, and I'm starting with the lower deck, which you see right here. Now one of the things that needs to be done here first is there's a lot of dye marks that are all over the floor, and also you can see there's some big square marks up along the wall, which are also dye marks, and these also have lines that run up along the sides of the walls. So what you need to do first, in order to have a nice smooth floor, is sand all that down. And some of the dye marks are like sink marks, which means they're pushed in, and they will need to be filled with either some putty or what I use is some thin CA glue, and then use an accelerator so that you can sand it down right away. Another tool that's very handy in a situation like this is a Dremel tool. I've got a big round grinding burr here in the chuck, and what I've started doing is just going over, and some of the high marks I'm grinding them down, and then the next stage will be to take this to a wash tub and use some wet dry sandpaper and sand everything down nice and smooth, and then the primer stage will be next. Now that I've got the bottom section finished, everything's sanded and ready to go, before I prime it I want to add the bunk support, which is this piece here, and these bunk support walls, and then I'm going to add all the bulkheads that go around the inside of the ship. First, these three pieces, the bunk support walls and the bunk support, have really bad sink marks here from the dyes, and what you need to do is fill those in. Now the easiest way to do that is to use a thick cyano glue, thick super glue, and just use a piece of stretch sprue or a toothpick or whatever, and just put a little dollop right in where the holes are, and then give it a shot of accelerator, and then you're ready to go. And you just have to you can use a file or some rough sandpaper, and just clean all those up, shape them down, and then you're finished and you're ready to go. And then I'm going to add all these pieces to the bottom, and then we'll be ready to prime it. At this point here in the construction stage, I've added these bulkheads, and there's 3 that go all the way around the ship, and they're all fitted in the same way. There's 2 little slots in the bulkhead part that fit into little holes in the floor here, and what you want to do is attach that to the floor first, and then you'll have to move these sides in just a little bit till they match up to the back of the bulkhead, and then just glue those in place. What I've done is I've used some super glue and to attach these. Then you'll have a seam that runs between the bulkhead and the side wall here, right along the part, and what I do for that is I use some coarse sandpaper, or you can use an emery file or a sanding board, and just go along there and file that so that both parts are even. And in the process of doing that, you're filling that seam with the residue from your sanding, which is the residue of the plastic. It'll fill that seam like a powder, and then you can take your super glue and just run a bead of it along that seam like so, and you can use the accelerator to speed up the process. Then go over it again lightly with your coarse sandpaper, okay? And once that's finished, you can clean that seam up really nice with a finer grade sandpaper. You'll notice in this section right here where you have to add this bulkhead, just ahead of it is another bulkhead, which is part number 27, and once the next level is added, you won't be able to see this rear bulkhead, so it's actually optional whether you want to add it or not, because like I said, this bulkhead here will hide whatever's going on back here. And when you add this piece here, you need to move it just ahead of the marks that are on the wall. It just makes for a better fit. In this section over here where you're adding the power station piece, here again, just make sure it aligns up, the side of the piece aligns with the walls, and there's a hole down here in the floor. I'm not quite sure what it was intended for, but it needs to be covered up. And there's also a square die mark just back in here if you would like to cover that up as well. This is a little alcove where the power station piece will fit, and the little square die mark that is embedded in the floor that I mentioned, I covered it up with a piece of 5 thou styrene sheet, and the small hole was plugged up with a some styrene dowel, and then I'll just sand this area smooth, sand it all flat and sand it smooth. This first painting stage here, I've gathered everything together that I want to paint light gray. You can see here I've got all these little chairs and these two little tables and this monitor, and this is the power station box, and I've got all these cleaned up, and I've mounted them on a piece of cardboard with using some double-sided tape. And here you can see the lower level, which is I've already primed it, and it's going to be painted light gray. I'm also going to paint these two panels here light gray, which will receive some more detail later on. And these are the two bunk walls that hold the bunk beds. They're going to be painted light gray, and they'll also receive some more detail later on. But right now I'm going to paint everything light gray, then we'll move on to the next stage of painting. Here you can see that I've got the overall light gray painted on, and I've masked off the base column for the crane, and as well as this large triangle area right here, and I'm going to paint those two dark gray, and then I'll use black wash as well to bring out the highlights and some light dry brushing. These stasis tube areas over here will be given a wash using some flat black paint to bring out the detail there. Here's a shot of the control panels, and how I've done these is I left the pieces attached to the sprues, and I painted the light gray. I just painted the whole thing light gray to isolate the raised panels you see here. Then to get the red in the background, what I did is I used a red wash, and I put 2 coats of it on there. Now what I'll do is once I remove the pieces from the sprues and clean them up, I'll just use a brush and paint the remaining red color, the rest of the frame and the legs. And what that does is it allows me to isolate these panels and gives you a nice clean line, so as not to have to mask everything off and paint it separately. Then I use some flat black, some white, and some yellow to highlight the little knobs and buttons and whatnot that you see here. Now, when I talk about doing wash, what I like to do is I like to use this Tamiya acrylic thinner. And what I'll do is I'll take a few drops of that, maybe 5 or 6 drops to 2 or 3 drops of paint. And this thinner works really well with the Tamiya paint as well as with the Model Master acrylics, and it gives you a really nice wash. You can see how I've painted these little armchairs here. I went over them with the light gray. They were airbrushed with the light gray. Then I used the black wash and let that seep into all the tiny little holes in the seats here, and just brushed it on overall the whole chair. Here you can see the chart table. This was painted light gray. I painted this little sheet here white and used dark gray for the arms of the drafting apparatus here, and just use a little light gray wash for this other little panel here. You can see here how I've painted this light gray, dark gray, and isolated these little triangles with white paint, and just use a light gray wash for this inner circle piece. And this other little console here was painted light gray, given a black wash, then isolated these panels here with black and did the little knobs with white, and I used some red up in the top here. Here you can see the assembly of the lower half of the hull. As you can see, it's a very large piece. It's comprised of 6 individual pieces, and the easiest way to tackle this obviously is to have a very large workspace. And what you need to do, and I'll zoom in here in a second, lay everything out, and you can see here I've clipped the ends off with clothespins, and the whole assembly tends to want to heave up in the center, but the center actually needs to be flat. This is the part that needs to be completely flat and leveled down, and it makes the assembly a little difficult. So what you need to do is start from one side and work your way around. Now I'm using CA super glue with an accelerator, okay, and you just want to get some glue in there, shoot it with the accelerator, and then move on to the next one. And as you go around, you'll see here you want to get some weight on it, okay, to keep this center flat and down, and keep it pushed down, because these final steps right here will be quite difficult. I've got some weight around the back side here of the sections that I've already assembled. Now I'm just going to hold that down like so. What you have here is a tab, okay, that's on the one piece, and it interlocks with these 2 little keys located on the opposite piece. So just hold that down firmly, and I'm quite liberal with the super glue here. Just put that on like so. Give it a shot with the accelerator. Wait till it seals itself up. Now this is the final section right here, which is a little tight. See that lock down there in place? The nice thing about using accelerator with the thin super glue is that it enables you to work really fast. Makes for a quick assembly. Also makes a good strong bond. So there you just have this thin super glue with the accelerator. Okay, so there you have the lower hull, the bottom half of the ship. That's been assembled here in the center. You can see how that is flat now, and the sides come up. Okay. Now what I'll do is go around the outer edge and attach these tabs together in the same manner that I did these with the super glue and the accelerator. And then you get to the fun part where you're ready to fill in all the seams between the interlocking pieces. Once you've gone around and attached all these outer rim tabs here, another thing that you want to do for some added strength is run some CA in between these two lines here where these two panels match up, and hold them together tight until the glue sets. And do this for all the ribs around the ship. In this shot here, you can see that all of the pieces for the lower half of the ship have been assembled. All the outer rim tabs have been attached, as well as the inner rim tabs from the inside. And I've started here by filling out these seams. My first coat pass was with a glazing spot putty that's used for automotive finishes, and then I sanded that down, and now I've added another layer of this glazing and spot putty here. It's made by Bondo. It's UV activated, and what it does is it goes on fairly smooth, like a thick paste. And I will take this outside now and set it in the sun, and I will bake this to a nice hard finish, and then I'll go over this again and sand it. Since there's only 3 legs on the ship, 3 of these need to be covered up. Now they do supply there is a supply in the kit to cover each one of these. So what you have to do is you just take the outer half that makes up the hull and glue these in place, just like this. And I've just used a thick super glue and with a CA with an accelerator, and I've just glued these in place, and then I'll sand this down and fill in any seams that need to be filled in after. These are some shots of the lower half interior of the ship. I'll just do a quick pass with the camera and zoom in on some of the areas. There's a communications area here, the gyroscope navigation console in the center. These are supports for the upper grid. Some little tables and chairs over in this area, scanners, stasis area back in here, and some bunks. There's also a main power access panel here, and here is the crane. as you can see in this area right here, I just neglected to paint this entire area back here, because what happens is once you add the second level, this is all covered up, so you're not going to see it anyways, and there's really no point in painting it. The only panel that you really will see is this forward panel right here. Here's a shot of the lower hull half. It's been primed, and what I'm about to do now is go over all the seams again. It's hard to show with the camera, but by running your hand over the seams, there's a slight hump over top of each one. Some are a little worse than others. So what needs to be done here is try to bring some of that down to get a nice smooth finish on the hull, as well as going over the landing wells that I've covered up here. And the reason I've primed this first is as you start to sand and you come down, the level begins to even itself out, and you see this because of the paint as you get down to the paint. So the primer is the indication that you're staying on a level keel as you're sanding. I'm just using some 120 grit sandpaper mounted to a piece of foam board with two-sided tape. Here you can see the finished assembly of the lower hull, and all the pieces have been assembled, as well as the lower dome and the power core. Now this bottom piece here is molded in clear plastic, so if somebody wanted to make an in-flight mode type ship, it would be this will come in very handy for adding lights or whatnot. And here you can see the 3 openings where the landing gear will go. This is a shot of the lower half of the hull, completely assembled with the lower dome, and it's been primed. I've applied 3 coats of primer once I achieved a nice smooth finish with all the seams, and the seams again were covered using automotive body putty and spot putty, glazing spot putty to finish up. The entire surface was then wet sanded with various grades of sandpaper, finishing off with a 1500 grit. Then I applied 4 coats of gray primer, and on top of that I've applied 3 coats of Monomaster acrylic clear gloss with my airbrush. The next step, I will follow up with the Turtle Wax polishing compound, which also has a scratch remover in it, and this will give me a perfectly smooth surface. Now you need to achieve this smooth surface when using any type of silver or chrome or metallized paint, because any small scratch or imperfections in the finish will show up. So now this is ready for the silver paint finish. Now, one thing you will find once you've assembled the hull sections together using the tabs and the super glue in the seams, it still is very flimsy. Now, one thing I did to add some strength to the shell, I used some mono foam, insulating foam, This stuff adheres very well to styrene plastic. And what I did was, working in between these sections, I sprayed the foam in a back and forth motion until each section was filled about halfway up. Now you're going to find, once the foam has cured overnight, that it does rise considerably, but you want that thickness in there, so make sure that it's laid in very tight and allow the foam to rise. And once it's dry, I just used my X-Acto saw and I just shaved it down to a level where it falls in between the height of these two sections. Another thing I did along the perimeter was add strips of 40 thou styrene sheet, just basically laminated right to the hull all the way around. Two very simple techniques, but you will find that it does add a considerable amount of strength to the shell, the hull. I also did use the same tactics that you see here for the top half. Once the two sections are matted together, the top and the bottom, the hull of the ship is very strong. Here you can see the completed lower half and upper half assembled together. I basically finished the upper half, upper level, in the same way I finished the lower level. It has the indentations from the ejector marks from the molds, which you will have to fill. And these run all the way around the outside as well as on the inside here in various locations. When assembling the two sections together, you have these little locator tabs. There's 3 of them. These need to be filled in and sanded smooth. Now I'll go over this again with the light gray paint to cover this up. When adding these dome supports to the walls, inside walls here, they each have little tabs that go into locator holes in the floor. I removed those tabs and assembled the support so that it fits tight up against the wall, because if you use the tabs and the locator holes in the floor, it leaves a considerable gap between the two pieces. This does make for a nice, neat finish, but also creates another problem when adding the upper dome, which I'll point out later. When finishing off this section here, I painted this console separately, dark gray, as well as the railings, dark gray, and then added them after the light gray finish was complete. While I was painting the light gray, I assembled this console as well as the 4 chairs and just painted that with the entire assembly. The instructions call for these panels over top of the curtains to be painted red, but once the upper dome is put in place, you can't really see them, so I just glued them in place and painted them light gray with the rest of the walls. The dome supports were painted light gray, then a black wash was used over top of them, followed up by a light dry brushing with the light gray paint to enhance the lines in the dome supports. The dome piece was painted light gray, and as I pointed out before, by moving the dome support struts so that they butted up against the walls, the problem that creates is that this dome support piece does not fit flush with the ceiling, because you need to have that little gap here, because there's a little bend up in here. So in order to fix that, I just basically use a file or you can use an X-Acto knife, and just cut a little notch in the end of the dome support here. And then the roof dome support will sit flush. Notice here again you've got these little holes and tabs for alignment. Use these for assembly and repeat like you did at the bottom. These need to be sanded flush, and then just touch up with the light gray paint. This is some footage of the lower half of the hull, and you can see here the painting is complete, and I've added the three legs. Now this landing leg here, which has the steps on it, the rails are attached to this side piece, and your best bet here is to attach the whole thing to the landing leg. Then once you're finished painting it silver, just go through with a brush and paint that railing red. It's a bit of a tedious job, but it will give you a nicer finish, and there's no real way of masking it or separating it. It's just best to do it that way. Here's a shot of the interior half of the lower hull once again. Now you can see the bracing strips of 40 thou styrene sheet that I added here around the edges. Also you can see the foam, the insulating foam. Once I completed the leg assemblies and had them painted, they just basically slip in through these slots. They just slide up in here, and there's a little pin on either side, which sits in a little slot, and then I just glued them in place with super glue on both sides. You could leave these loose if you like, with some sort of bracing over top, so that the legs had the ability to move up and down. For this leg assembly here, I painted the bottom, which matches the hull contour, and the sides the same color as the hull, the aluminum metallizer. And then for the stairs, I painted them stainless steel, just to give it a little bit of a contrast. And here again you can see the red railings. Here you can see the interior assembly, which is complete, and it just slides in place within this inner ring. And just make sure that the openings where the legs are align with one of the doors, one of the bulkhead doors on the inside. Here you can see where I filled in the holes where the little tabs are, and I've also cleaned up the seam, filled it and sanded it with some squadron white putty and super glue. I filled these seams in all the way around, and then just went back with the light gray and touched up the areas where I had sanded. It just gives this area a nicer finish, neater look, because once the top dome goes on, whether you use the clear or whether you paint your top dome silver, if you make it removable, once that comes off, you will be able to see this areas here. Here you can see two of the support rods which run from the lower level floor all the way to the top of the dome structure here. These were painted dark gray and added to the lower level assembly. Then the upper half was added, and then the upper dome structure was added. Then these were glued in place to this top ring here. They do need to be chopped down about 2/32 of an inch to get a nice tight fit. In this area here you can see the hatch, which is on the lower level beside the bunks, and then the crane which sits on the floor in front of it. Now, according to the instructions, the diagram shows the crane going on top of the hatch. So that's one little correction that was made there. This is the tiny Robbie robot. It fits inside. He stands about 1.5 inches tall. Was painted with Model Master exhaust metallizer paint. Robbie comes molded in clear, so in order to keep the clear dome untouched, I sanded it smooth with 1500 grit sandpaper, then masked it off with some rubber masking compound, and then painted the exhaust metallizer paint. Robbie comes, as I said, molded in clear, but also in two pieces. So there's a seam that runs down the side all the way around, and the two arms also come separately. This is the completed lower half of the hull. You can see the landing pads in place. The finish on this is the base coat was Krylon chrome. I followed that up by using some Model Master metallizer lacquer exhaust buffing metallizer. This stuff doesn't need any thinning, it just goes straight through the airbrush. Goes on nice and smooth. Now this color was used to highlight the edges around here, the outer rim, up here and around here. Also around the landing bays, the gear. Also, I took just a simple piece of cardboard and laid down here like this, and then you just use your airbrush and just go in a light sweeping motion, and that gives you a nice hard line there. I chose this particular painting scheme because I wanted to give the hull, the entire ship, a look of sort of a distressed look from being in space, as opposed to a nice bright shiny finish. Here's the finished product with the clear dome in place. The C57D Star Cruiser from the Forbidden Planet classic sci-fi movie. The ship is very large. It's almost 30 inches in diameter and roughly stands about 12 inches tall.